I think I know everybody. I'm Jean Stellman, and very happy to have you join us for our next Tuesday talk, which I'm personally very much looking forward to. We are in the midst of trying to see whether there is some way to have something in December in person. We'll let you know that. And we'll have a new newsletter out soon with what's going on and with the next graduate scholar talk. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to steering committee member Elliot Sklar.
Thank you. Hold on one second. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Klaus Jacob. What happened was Jean had said to me, did we know anyone who could speak on this question of flooding and climate change? And that was one of the easiest assignments I ever had. I said, oh, I know who to get right away. And it was Klaus. And Klaus is a seismologist and geophysicist. And I first met him many years ago. There was a point, being in a planning program in an architecture school, there's a certain tension that always arises because the architects who dominate the school think that urban planning is just about site planning. And they don't understand why there are all these other questions. Nonetheless, at one point, I was asked to take over the program, and it was in very bad shape. And what I realized was that the program needed to be hooked up to dealing with all these new environmental challenges, and when I realized that, and I turned to the Earth Institute and my old friend Art Werner Lamb, and immediately Klaus's name came up. And while I was there, we set up 3 studios. I didn't run them, but Sig Grava ran the studios, and Sig and Klaus just hit it off. And the 3 studio projects that I remember that really got us launched on making the urban planning program a much more about sustainability was one was in Caracas, Venezuela. One was in Istanbul, and one was in Accra in Ghana. And the Caracas studio dealt with the fact that all of the slum housing was on these hills that sloped out of the city and were subject to being washed away. The Ghana studio, Accra, was once again about being flooded away in the seacoast. The only one that was a little different was Istanbul, where all of the upscale development was taking place along a major earthquake fault line. And so the 3 studios all had to deal with, how do you deal with these predictable yet unknown natural disasters, and deal with them both in terms of the science of it and the politics of it. That was I remember one of the first questions I was asked by somebody at the Earth Institute. They said the 3 bridges that crossed between Brooklyn and Manhattan, within the next 100 years, there was surely going to be a collapse. How would I convince the mayor to do something? And I said, in my professional opinion, lots of luck. Mayors don't deal with the things, even if they have a certainty, but low probability on their watch. Anyway, Klaus was amazing at being able to link up all of the physical spatial stuff with the kind of political and social and economic issues that our students brought to it. So and I have over the years found Klaus to be an amazing person to talk to about these issues, about the future of our new campus, among other things, and the location of it. And I think you're all going to enjoy this presentation. And let me just turn it over to Klaus, who I know has prepared an excellent presentation for us.
Well, Thank you, both Jean and Elliot. And let me share my screen, and then hopefully we will go right into it. Hold on a second. Can you see my screen? Elliot, you are muted. Please
Yeah,
come.
you're fine.
Let me unmute. Yes, put it on the exit.
Yeah, well,
Click on that. That's great. Oh, that's perfect. Everyone can see that.
or at least should. Well, welcome. It's an honor to give this little talk here at a time when people assemble in Glasgow and actually try to put some nails into this coffin here called climate change. I gave it the title Floods from Above and Below, and what to do about it, because in our area here in the metropolitan area in New York City, we had opportunities to see both flooding from coastal storm surges and recently very heavy precipitation flooding. So what are we talking about here? I want to address 4 topics. First, I want to give practically with a single slide a 10,000-year overview. I also want to introduce the concept of risk, because climate change will really pose some incredible and hard to deal with risks. And I think we are largely still in denial about that. The second topic then will be give an overview of some of the key issues of climate change from cause to consequence. But I also want to emphasize that there's always a stress between mitigating climate change, meaning reducing greenhouse gases, and adapting to the consequences from our greenhouse gases that we already have put in and still are putting in. The third topic then I will exemplify with New York City, flooding from below. I will use Sandy that occurred in 2012 and discuss it in the context of sea level rise, which will amplify this particular flooding hazard from below. And then from floods from above, I will use Ida, which occurred just early September of this year, and the related extreme precipitation urban flash flooding. And then we will have a quick look at what we can do about it in the short and midterm issues. Short means, in my vocabulary, a few years. Midterm means probably a few decades, and long-term, what we have to consider as a society by the year 2100 and beyond. So here's the big 10,000-year picture, where my pointer is, that's 0, that's the present time. And then we look back 20,000 years in the past, and we look forward 10,000 years into the future. What you see in the last 20,000 or so years, minus 7,000, that sea level rose is a consequence of the receding glaciers in North America and Scandinavia, where the water of those land-based ice masses ended up in the ocean. It rose more than 100 meters, more than 300 feet. And then about 7,000 years ago, from then on to present, sea level was amazingly constant. Not only the sea level, but the climate itself was. And it's in those last 7,000 years when civilizations as we sort of know it has developed. So our civilization developed during a time of constant sea level. And that haunts us because what we have done here, what's called today, we put all those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and our future sea level could look like this, depending on how many gigatons of carbon we put in the atmosphere. And if you look at those numbers here, they go from about 25 meters to 50 meters. That's 75 feet to 150 feet of sea level rise. Good luck. And that's why Paris was convened in 2015 in bringing those numbers, not along those blue lines, but bringing things below the red line. Maybe this, if it must be, no, Paris would be down here. And that's the challenge we have to face. So our problem is that all our cities, past and present, have been developed on coasts that had a stable sea level. And now we're in a real deep trouble. Risk. You can consider climate change, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, as a form of risk management. Well, if we manage risk, we better understand what risk is. So what is risk? Well, on the bottom line here, risk is the product of three factors: a hazard, the assets that are exposed to the hazards. Please mute yourself. And the third factor is the vulnerability of the assets given the hazard. And it's in this overlap where the risk resides. Now, given that concept, how do we manage risk? What options do we have? Well, we can make this hazard circle smaller, meaning we have to reduce our greenhouse gases, and then all the climate change, like sea level rise and storm surges and so on, will get less. So this circle becomes smaller, so the overlap with the assets and the vulnerability will become smaller. We even can, by engineering locally, restrain the hazards to certain areas by building barriers, levees, and dams, and hide behind them. But another one is, and that's Elliot's stronghold here, land use and zoning. If we do it right, we can prevent at least future assets built in hazardous zones. Or we even can do the reverse. We can retreat with our assets, people, communities, out of hazard zone. And that's called strategic retreat or managed retreat. Some say relocation, because retreat rhymes with defeat, and that's how it is often conceived. But it's really building a better future. It's not a defeat. Here I come now to my second part after these introductory remarks. Climate change from cause to consequence. So we have spent about the last 100 years burning fossil fuels to satisfy our energy needs. The consequence, of course, was greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The consequence of that is there's global warming. And that happens to be both in the atmosphere first and then with some time delay in the oceans. When the ocean gets warmer, it thermally expands. So the sea level rises just from the oceans getting bigger from thermal expansion. But also the land-based ice that we still have, like in Greenland and Antarctica, is melting and adds water to the ocean. Now, it turns out that warmer oceans cause more evaporation. It's just like if you turn on the heat under your water pot on your stove. But also, warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. And together, those two phenomena, warmer ocean and warmer atmosphere with more moisture, create stronger hurricanes or tropical storms, which in turn cause more severe coastal storm surges, not the number so much of storm surges or hurricanes, but their severity increases. And that, of course, combined with the heavy rain that comes out of that moist atmosphere, will create more severe flooding. Now, I have a few things here in red because not all places on the earth are lucky enough to receive moisture, like our southwestern portions of California. So they, because of the atmosphere is warmer, have to deal with droughts and heat waves, but also in New York City, we will have to deal with more heat waves. And in turn, in some areas, that causes wildfires. And if after wildfires, some heavy rain comes down, that causes mud flows. So these are some of the hazards that we have to deal with. There are many others, water shortages, you name it, and so on. But these are the ones that I want to highlight here. One thing I want to emphasize, you always have to look together for how coastal storm surges interact with rising sea level. In coastal areas, that's absolutely crucial, and we will return to that topic in a moment. So why is our built environment so vulnerable? Because where we have built, but also how we have built. And that applies to entire cities, but also its individual buildings, and very importantly, to our infrastructure that we all rely on, whether it's power, whether it's sewer, water, garbage, you name it, communication, and so on. And we have built in flood zones right now, but we have to be very careful, because it's not only the current flood zones we have to worry about. We have to worry about where the future flood zones develop with sea level rise and more severe rainfalls. We also have built over the decades, particularly in the US suburbia, more into wildfire zones. People like to live in the wilderness or on the edge of it. Well, that causes problems. In terms of the how we have built, well, our vulnerable designs are often not really designed to live with floods. They are designed to make it comfortable for people. And floods is often an afterthought in our design. We have inadequate drainage. Our sewer systems are not meant to deal with these heavy precipitation events. We have built a lot of parking lots, a lot of rooftops that send off all this water right into our drainage and makes it even worse. And in terms of wildfires, many of our housing materials, wood in particular, is highly flammable. And so if we would have brick buildings, that would be easier in some of those wildfire zones. People sit right now in Glasgow and discuss right the issues that are shown here on that slide. You have here a time scale from 1990 to 2030. So we are sitting right now here under that peak in the graph. And what is plotted here is the global greenhouse gas emissions, meaning the annual gigatons of CO2 emitted every year. And you see how that just in the last 30 years or so still was rising incredibly, even so we knew very well that this is not a smart thing to do. Then in 2015, around this time here, Paris came along, and there was an agreement. There are a few years we still can let it rise, but we really have to turn around by 2020 or thereabouts and get on this green path if we want to achieve a stabilized temperature increase in the atmosphere of 1.5 degrees centigrade, a few degrees Fahrenheit, above the 2000 levels. And that is our challenge. How do we get towards that green curve for our global greenhouse gas emissions? What the nations had pledged is here in blue. So even the pledges that have been made post-Paris Agreement are totally insufficient to come even close to what the Paris Agreement would require. Here you have a similar plot for the four largest emitters on this earth. China is by far the largest emitter. They took over from the United States being the largest emitters sometime before 2010, and have been increasing rapidly in developing their industrialization and their energy hunger, mostly through coal-fired power plants, which is the worst CO2 emitter that you can use. Their policies here in gray turn that around somewhat. They have even made some pledges that are a little bit better than their actual policies, but they are still far away from the Paris target line here shown in blue-green. The United States has a little bit a smaller gap between its policies and the targets, and the pledges were pretty good, but we just haven't lived up to our pledges, in part, of course, during the Trump administration that actually revoked our Paris Agreement and that we have rejoined, but we have lost ground here. The European Union has the smallest gap and has smaller emissions. And it's interesting to look at these two, call it developed economies versus the still developing economies, and particularly in India, where that is not even curving around much here, except very lately by having made some changes from coal-fired power plant to gas-fired power plants. But their pledges that they internationally made post-Paris are allowing them still to go up, up, up. And it will be very interesting to see how Glasgow will modify this or not. So they also have a gap between their path where they ought to go or where they're allowed to go. Paris allowed them to be much more emitting, CO2 emitting than some of the other nations. In any case, we see that there's a big difference between developed economies and developing economies. And then there are the real South, economic South, that isn't even shown here. On the upper left here now, it's not emissions. This is the temperature increase that comes about with different pathways in emitting. This would be here close to the Paris Agreement that ends up with about 1.5 degrees and plateaus out near that level around 2100. There are different pathways that scientists have developed, namely economic developments, population developments, and how we use and produce energy, whether with fossil fuels or not. The RCP, the representative concentration pathway, 2.6, that would be sort of the most compatible with Paris. And if you translate that here into sea level rise, it would be this path down here. But there's the ominous prospect that if we don't behave right, or if we don't have the science yet quite right, and Greenland melts away and Antarctica melts away, we could end up here. And that would be truly devastating and would happen over in multi-decadal timescale, where we would hardly have time to adapt our large cities, coastal cities, to this problem. One other thing we have to keep in mind, that I just showed you what happens out to the year 2100. The real problem comes in the centuries thereafter, when Greenland and Antarctica really start to contribute to this. So when you go out to the year 2300, you talk about multi-meters, meaning 10 to 20 feet of sea level rise, unless we get this under control here. One other factor that's very important to keep in mind is this. What I have shown you so far are global average sea level rise trends. What I say here is that the local sea level rise can differ substantially from the global average trends that we have looked at so far. So in many cases, the local sea level rise, or sometimes called the relative sea level rise, is substantially higher than the global average. Lo and behold, that applies to New York City. New York City sea level rise forecast is made by NPCC, that stands for the New York Panel on Climate Change. And I served on that since Mayor Bloomberg created it in 2008 for about 11 years, and I quit then in 2019. But here in 2015, the forecasts that you see here in inches or feet and equivalent meters on the vertical axis and time reference to the year 2000 is expressed as a probability. Now, what in the heck does this mean? Here, the 90 percentile probability means the following. There are all these many forecasts that many different scientific teams and different pathways and energy pathways and so on allow you to make. 90 percentile means that 90% of all these different forecasts of sea level rise are at this red curve or below, and 10% are still above. And the recommendation of the NPCC was that the 90 percentile should be used. Now, many say, why not using the average? Why the 90 percentile? I give you a good example about risk. If you buy an airline ticket to fly out to San Francisco, and the airline tells you, you have a 90% chance to arrive, but you have a 10% chance that the plane will fall out of the sky, you might not want to take that plane. I bet you won't. You will go for 99 or better. So why should cities fare less safely? So 90 percentile sounds high, but in a risk context for millions of people, that's actually not such a high percentile to take as a target. In 2019, the NPCC added actually 2 values for the 80s and the end of the century, close to 7 feet and close to 10 feet, with the so-called RM. RM stands for Arctic Rapid Ice Melt Scenario. So the NPCC felt that it was important to keep that in mind, that even the 90 percentile might be something that is too mild, and we may have to think, what if? That doesn't mean we have to plan definitely for it, but we have to ask ourselves, what do we do if? What if? Now, here's a little bit of complicated graphs, so bear with me for a moment. We have time again here, a little bit more than 100 years on the horizontal scale. And now the vertical scale here in feet, above a certain North American vertical datum, forget about what that means, shows a red curve, a green curve, a purple, and a blue. These are the elevations in the year 2000 that a 10-year storm, a 100-year storm, a 500-year storm, and a 700-year storm on average would reach at the Battery Park tide gauge. Sandy nominally was a 700-year storm by its storm surge. So it was about 11.5 feet above the datum. Now, if we walk to a subway entrance at an elevation of 11.5 feet above sea level, that was flooded during Sandy, and march forward in time and walk in and out of that same subway entrance, then we see that in year 2090, not a 700-year storm, but a 10-year storm will flood the same subway entrance. Why? Because all these storm surge heights get uplifted with sea level, and I have used here the 90 percentile of the NPCC. And that makes nowadays a 700-year storm flood the subway entrance, but in 2090, a 10-year storm will flood the same entrance. If you divide 700 by 10, that is a factor of 70. The risk by 2090 for the flooding will increase by a factor of 70. And that's why I told you before, we have to look at the coastal storm surges and sea level rise together to fully understand our risk exposure in the future. Now, here, forget about storms. I have a couple of maps, the 3 maps in blue. What they show is in a little bit of a darker blue, what's called the flooding for a 3-foot sea level rise at a daily mean high water. Now, you know that we have tides that go up and down twice a day. If you take the higher values, the 2 highest tide every day, and average them over a couple of decades, then that's called mean high water. So it's being reached 1 to 2 times per day during the high tides, okay? If sea level rises 3 feet, then these areas here in the Arkansas River, but also around Jamaica Bay and a few places in Queens, the water will show up twice a day on a nice sunny day without storms, just from the high tides, daily high tides. If we have 6 feet of sea level rise, then you see how the high tide started to encroach on quite a bit of Brooklyn and more portions of Queens, and forget almost the Hackensack River and portions here of New Jersey, but also in Staten Island. With 10 foot of sea level rise, the twice daily tides show up in quite a large area. In fact, if you compare this map where the tides show up on a daily basis with the Sandy map here on the right, they almost correspond 1-to-1. That means on a sunny day, we will have a flood like we had during Sandy. And that ain't good. Daily, not a 700-year storm, a daily flooding event. So here's Sandy, and now I come to part three, how past events and current events affect ourselves and have impact on us. Here's Sandy. It was a huge storm, and in the northern hemisphere, all storms have an anti-clockwise rotation, the way I indicate this here with my pointer. That means on the right-hand side where it makes landfall, the wind blows from the ocean to the land, meaning it drives the water towards the land. On the left side, it's the opposite. The waves go out rather than coming in. So if you have a house on the right side of storm, quickly pack it up and bring it over to the left side. But we, meaning New York City, Long Island, and the likes, were on the right side. Whoops. That was too much. And that's what it looked in the hours before. Sandy itself made actually landfall in the dark evening hours. It was October 29, so it was at 9 o'clock in the evening, so it was already dark. So that's in the hours before it made landfall. And you see that obviously we have structures in places that are not meant to encounter storm surges. Many people did evacuate to evacuation centers, but not all. And when the emergency services try to get and rescue them, they really have problems. So follow the advice for emergency evacuations. Many people had to leave their cars behind, and there were tens of thousands of cars. I myself lost, actually, my family lost 2 cars in that. So even experts are foolish enough. Probably one of the most remarkable impacts of Sandy was its impact on the subway system. So here is Lower Manhattan, here is Brooklyn, that's the East River, and you see the crossings of some of the subway lanes and tunnels under the East River. Everything that's solid blue here, the tunnels were flooded from bottom to top. If they are stippled, they are partially flooded. And if they're gray, they don't flood at all. And the other ones we didn't even consider because they are high-lying enough. And when I say we didn't consider, because that's from a study that was completed a year before Sandy, and we handed that over to the MTA. It was done with the help of engineering students of Columbia, together with George Deodatis, their professor in civil engineering, and myself. And so we published this report, and the MTA had it a year before Sandy arrived. In fact, they were thinking of using when Irene in August of 2011 arrived, but Irene just stayed 1 foot below that critical level here. And when Sandy arrived, they took this map and sent actually their people into the tunnels and they ripped out the crucial, critical control and signal systems. So the salt water that comes in from the ocean, from the storm surge, wouldn't get in and ruin them permanently. So they ripped them out, brought them to the surface. The water got in the tunnels, the mud, they pumped out the water, they removed the mud, brought the stuff, the control systems back into the tunnel, reinstalled it, and lo and behold, after 1 week, the subway was running again. This was miraculous. We had forecasted it would take at least 3 weeks, maybe a month, because you can't buy those control systems. Some of them are 100 years old. You know, the subway started in 1904. You can't get them off the shelf. And that's why we thought it would take at least a month that the subway would be shut down. Now, this difference between a month shutdown and only a week, if you multiply that with a good fraction of the economic output of New York City, which is $4 billion a day, at least it was during Sandy time, and I'm sure what it's now under COVID conditions. This measure, this operational measure by the MTA to take out this control system, saved New York's economy tens of billions of dollars. It was really a smart way. And I think Columbia should be proud that it contributed with this map to actually encourage this action, which the MTA took. The other effect, of course, there was a Con Edison station here on the East River near 23rd Street, I believe, that blew up a transformer, a substation, which put lower Manhattan, except around the World Trade Center that had its own power, into the dark for almost a week. People called this SOPO, in analogy to Soho, except it stands here south of power outage. And the line here was about the 42nd Street or so. Anything below was out for almost a week, which of course contributed substantially to an economic loss as well, and made the recovery very difficult for those people who had to dry out their basements without a power. That was what I just told you, flooding from below. Now let's look at the latest event for flooding from above. The event we had on September 1st and 2nd was called the post-tropical cyclone Ida. And here in this inset, you see how it developed as a hurricane. And just before it made landfall in Louisiana, you see the red, that means it was a Category 4 hurricane. And then it lost quickly as it traveled across southern and southeastern United States and approached here the New York City metropolitan area. But because of its rotating air mass, it brought a lot of moist air from the Atlantic on the land. And that caused here this incredible rainfall pattern that you see here with the highest values in New Jersey, but even in Central Park here, where it's a little bit less in New Jersey, we had for the total storm more than 7 inches of rainfall, but it set a new record for an hourly rate of more than 3 inches in an hour. Which was interesting because the prior record just had been set less than 2 weeks earlier, namely on August 21st, by the storm named Henri, which was then just below 2 inches per hour. So when you see records being broken in such rapid sequence, you know that something weird is going on, and that weird thing is called climate change. And that's what we have to deal with and adapt to. The impacts of Ida, there were just in the eastern United States, 56 fatalities, of which 18 in New York State, 5 in Pennsylvania, 2 in Maryland, 1 in Connecticut, and 1 in Virginia. In New York City, there were 13 out of the 18 in New York, of whom 11 died in basement dwellings in Queens. And I will come back to that in a moment. The total dollar losses was about, from this heavy rainfall, in the order of $20 billion, compared to more than 40, some say $60 billion, but insured loss for Sandy was $40 billion. Just to give you a reference that rainfall can do a lot of damage to not just coastal storm surges. Transportation, all subway lines were shut down. More than 1,000 riders had to be evacuated from 17 stranded trains. A total of 46 MTA buses got stranded. The Metro North line was shut down because of landslide in Upper Manhattan. The Long Island Railroad lines were shut down. New Jersey Transit was shut down, but one line. Amtrak lines were suspended. New York State Thruway even was closed down. Now, this is a remarkable number here, not just for the Eastern US, but Ida as a whole. It destroyed 200,000 cars that ended up being in flood zones. And when water gets in our digitally controlled cars these days, that's the end of them. If you assign about an average value of $5,000, which is, there are cheaper ones, and I'm sure there are much more expensive ones, that alone is $1 billion here. So you see how widely spread some of the impacts are. They are not just for our built environment, but our living conveniences, including cars. Housing stock, more than 1,000 buildings in New York City were severely damaged. 234 of the 1,600 public school buildings were flooded, which is really bad news, because when you have mold developing school buildings, that's a serious health threat. And then the basement apartments in Queens were especially vulnerable, and that's where these 11 fatalities occurred. Here is a neighborhood in Queens a few days after Ida, and you see how people dealt with all that rubbish that got wet and flooded and threw it out. It's not nice to be flooded out. Now, we worry here on the East a lot about too much water, while in the West, they worry about too little, many times at least. In the lower left here, this is the map of wildfires just for this year, 2021. Much of it in California, but also in Oregon, Montana, Idaho, Washington. But even here on the East Coast, we get the effects of these fires, both in the US and adjacent Canada, by all this soot drifting over and showing up sometimes in quite high concentration in the atmosphere. And people with asthma really got to feel this. You could see it with wonderful sunsets as well. Makes wonderful sunsets over New Jersey when you look across the Hudson River. But it's all this stuff that gets from these hot fires up into the air that ends up the atmosphere and really causes not just the direct damage, but also health hazards. Part 4, what do we do about this? Well, let's get back to flooding from below. Post Sandy, there was a competition that got started by HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Federal Agency, that put a few $1 billion into a design competition. And one of the winning projects was the so-called Big U, a U that wraps around Lower Manhattan in the form of parks, hiding behind that seawalls, dikes, levees, and the like to keep the water out. Since then, this project has been broken down in 5 or 6 different subunits, each with own funding stream, even own jurisdictions, because Battery Park is not a New York City owned territory. It's a New York State owned territory through the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, okay? And so they all have to have their own funding streams. The only one that's right now not only funded, but where construction has started is here on the Lower East Side, above the Brooklyn Bridge, Manhattan, and below the Williamsburg Bridge. So that is the only one has its money together and is shovel ready. What was of concern to the mayor was that here the financial district, lo and behold, had no funding behind it. So he called upon the New York State or New York City Economic Development Corporation. That's what it's called, New York City Economic Development Corporation, to develop a plan for this. And they came up with a plan which, from where I sit and probably where I would assume Elliott sits, is really absolutely short-sighted. And here it is. So that's this area from roughly the seaport down to the tip of Manhattan. You see it here and a few in the lower left here, encircled by red. This area here is proposed to be a new extension of Manhattan into the water by filling the land and then have private developers come up with the rest of the money of multi-billion dollars investments to do new real estate development, both for businesses and luxury housing. I think, well, I have to bite my tongue since we're having it recorded. I think it's coming close to a public crime. Why? Because if you look where we have our flood zones nowadays, they're all in filled land. True, this fill will be a little bit higher, but higher means only that it will be flooded later. So it's a short to midterm boondoggle and long-term misinvestment. And what we see here is, of course, happening in many places, all the way down to Florida, Palm Beach, and you name it. But we have our own Palm Beach here in New York City. Let's step to Midtown Manhattan on the East River and look from Manhattan over to Williamsburg. That's what you see is going up here. This thing here and this thing here in gray, blue-gray, they are almost finished and ready to be occupied. The one in the middle just has been proposed. We are still doing development on the waterfront. Yes, a few feet higher, and some of the lower floors are very well developed to counter any flooding. But in the long run, these buildings will be islands. And who wants to live in an island when you want to go to the grocery store and you have to swim to your shop? And the taxis will have to be amphibian taxis, and the garbage trucks will have to be barges, or we make more high lines to connect all those buildings so we get from one to the other? That's a nice challenge for urban planners, right? If we do foolish things like that. So I think we really haven't come to grips what sea level really means for coastal cities, including our very own here in New York. So some people said, oh, no problem. There's a simple solution. We built a barrier here across the Arthur Kill, another one near the Verrazano Bridge, and another one near the Whitestone or Throcknett's Bridge. You know, the Thames has its barriers. St. Petersburg has it. Venice has it. There are even a few cities in New England who have it. Why don't we build a barrier system? And the Dutch have it, of course. And we don't have to worry what's happened behind here. And then the US Army Corps of Engineers came along and said, oh, there's even a better plan. And it's supported by a private citizen group that has eagerly pursued this plan. It's the US Army Corps of Engineers HATS plan. HATS stands for Harbor and Tributary Study, the two barrier proposal. This is one barrier on the outer harbor connecting Sandy Hook with Coney Island, and another one here on the East River Inlet. And that will solve the problem. It will keep all the storm surges out in the future. It's open normally and let the ships through and the water in and out. But when a storm comes, you close it and the storm stays out in the open and the storm surge doesn't get into the inner or outer harbor. Wonderful solution, right? What's wrong with that? Well, let's think a little bit. Because not only do we have storm surges, we have sea level going on. Now, initially at current sea level, most of the time, the barriers will be open. But as sea level rises, and I have shown you earlier, the flooding can look, when it approaches 10 feet of sea level rise, it can look like Sandy. So you want to close the barriers to keep the sea level rise out. So we are sitting here in a bathtub behind, and that's what, for instance, New Orleans has been doing for a couple of decades already. So is that so bad? Well, hold on, folks. We have a river here called Hudson. Actually, the Indians called it the river that flows both ways because it was a tidal river. And we have a Raritan River. And they want to get out to the ocean. So if we close those barriers for good to keep the sea level rise out, we get flooded from behind from our lovely Hudson and Raritan River. So the barriers don't do a damn thing for sea level rise. They're only good for keeping short-term storm surges out for hours or half a day or something like that. And that will be even the case at high sea level in the future, because those storms will be on top of the high sea level. So there will be a Sandy on top of a Sandy high sea level rise. You can keep that Sandy in 2100 very well out with those barriers. But you can't keep the sea level rise out because we have those rivers that want to get out. New Orleans, US Army Corps of Engineers, bypass or try to bypass the river in keeping the river at a higher level than the city through levees and dam systems and so on. And that's why, of course, during Katrina, when these things failed, you had catastrophic flooding happen. So barriers are not a long-term solution. They cost about $60 to $120 billion. People are not clear, in that range somewhere. And the question is, shouldn't we spend those 60 to 120 billion dollars for other things? And that's what we discuss. What are those possible and other things? And I use this topographic map here to discuss the basic three modes of adaptation. Protection, we just discussed, whether it's locally around the Big U in Manhattan and other places, or keeping the whole ocean out with Dutch-style US Army Corps of Engineer type barriers at the outer harbor. But that works only for decades, not for centuries. Accommodation, I will not talk much about it. That's at places where you have individual houses that you can raise up on stilts and lift them out of the flood zone, and you get a reduction from your national flood insurance program. But again, your car on the parking lot will flood, and you have to swim to your job if during a flood. And so these accommodation things, similar to protection, have only temporary value. The only sustainable solution, whether we like it or not, is strategic relocation or managed retreat to higher ground. That's a hard pill to swallow. Luckily, New York City has high grounds in yellow and brown. The lower elevations are shown in lighter green and darker green, lowest. Our highest points without any housing, wonderful new future developments, right? What are they? They are our graveyards, our cemeteries. So sometimes I say sarcastically, let's have the living and the dead change places. And they are privately owned, so watch out what will happen to them. But what have we been doing in the past? Here is a map that shows the difference in population between the 2000 and 2010 census. I don't have an equivalent map yet for the 2020 census difference between 2020 and 2010. The areas, the census tracts in blue here, that's where we put additional population into it. And the darker blue means we have put a lot more people in it. The red areas here, we actually have thinned out the population. Maybe apartments in New York City and in Manhattan got too expensive, so some people had to move out to cheaper places. And the richer people have more demand and square footage. So if you now compare this map with a topographic map, you will see that we have thinned out the safe high-lying places and have put in a lot more people into low-lying, unsafe places. That's the facts. So we are still in denial. Our policies are not matching where we need to go if we want to have a sustainable New York City, a climate change sustainable New York City. There's a whole litany of things that I have listed here, what we can do to adapt to flooding from above. I don't want to go through all that listing here because I think we're running short on time. But bioswales and plantings, rain gardens can help a little bit on the sidewalks, as shown here. So we have to minimize the runoff and we have to increase our drainage capacity, our sewer system. When it still floods on the streets, well, then we have to have this stuff here, what the MTA did, building huge tunnels, doors. This is the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel that gets shut down so the tunnel doesn't flood. Or here on the sidewalk on 4th Avenue in Brooklyn, you see, for instance, that the MTA put out some benches. Well, underneath is actually the subway ventilation grate, and it prevents, when the street floods, for the water to run into the subway like you see it here. That's a problem. When through the ventilation grates, the water runs into the subway system. Another solution is, again, just a little bit elevation over the subway ventilation grate. This is a bicycle stand. Nice little solution. Here, the MTA shows off their ventilation grates that are built into it. They flip over the buckets when a little bit water gets in, and that shuts them off. Very ingenious design that doesn't need any people to do anything like here, where you need the manpower to really make things safe. So I think I have spent enough time and stretched your patience. Let me sum up. We need both mitigation and adaptation that are equally urgent. It's not an either or. We need to reduce greenhouse gases so we don't have to adapt so much in the future. Mitigation, by its very nature that the atmosphere is international, tends to be top-down, both from an international, intergovernmental to federal, state, local level, and then it ends up on the community and household level. Sure, you yourself in your household can install, maybe if you have a private house, solar panels, and drive a electric car instead of a SUV. Adaptation definitely works best from the bottom up, from the household, community to municipality, county, state, and federal level. And yes, there's some international issue too, because there will be international climate change, migration from climate refugees. This will be a huge problem. Just think of tens of millions of people being displaced out of Bangladesh, Vietnam, you name it. And actually Syria had seen this not by flooding, but by drought, where people poured into the cities that caused uproar and contributed to the situation in Syria. Now, both mitigation and adaptation require major financial funding. This will be for the US in the many, many trillions of dollars. So the legislations that we bicker about it right now in DC are just sort of breadcrumbs compared to the loaves and loaves that we need to really make progress on this, both on the mitigation side, namely energy transformation from fossil fuels to sustainable green energy, but also in terms of the adaptation, and we discussed many of those issues. Now there's one big issue, equity issues, both on a global scale and a local. Global, the North-South conflict. Local, just think of the Rockaways versus Manhattan. This is an opportunity as well as a challenge to solve long-standing underlying problems. But it needs a benevolent government. It needs civic engagement. It needs champions, and it requires a vision and persistence and sense of urgency, that all of which we lack right now. And even a comprehensive plan as it is right now before the city council and actually has been approved Not sure it has been signed into law yet by the mayor, are only first steps in the right direction. It needs money, 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 both public and private sector money. And as I just have shown, we still spend the private sector money in the wrong places and developing in unsustainable locations. Well, there was a guy more than 5,000 years ago. His name was Noah. He saw the flood coming. He did the right thing. He was actually very ecological and ecumenical about it, and did not just save himself. He took a whole bunch of nice folks with him. And you don't want to end up like these dinosaurs here on this island. Timing is crucial, and foresight is crucial. This guy knew what strategic retreat means. Let's see whether we can talk to some people that may not believe science, but read the Bible, whether that helps in convincing them. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer some questions.
Can you unshare your screen, Klaus? It was wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, I knew that this was the right upbeat presentation. Anyway, but I think everyone has come away now with a much better sense, Klaus, of the dimensions of this issue. I think we've all of us have understood pieces of it, have experienced part of it, but I think what you've done for us today is pulled together the larger picture of the incredible challenge that is ahead of us. So thank you very much. And I think we could open it to I don't know, either in the chat or people raise their hands, because we have a few minutes to take a few questions. Anybody wants it, you could speak up, because
I have a question, Klaus. What role does all of this, besides impermeable surfaces, what is all the building over natural waterways? Meadowbrook Parkway is built over Meadowbrook, and all the other places where we've covered up the underground city of waters that we have.
Yeah, well, there's a movement underway, including, for instance, in Westchester here, north of Manhattan, to daylight certain old waterways. Okay, that's a commendable situation, but unless it increases the capacity to lead the water out into the harbor, that would need a very careful assessment whether or not that diminishes the flood risks. On the other hand, the very fact to make people aware that we have plastered over all these surfaces, made them impermeable and invisible, that we have done so, is, I think, more an educational than a risk reduction measure. So in that sense, I welcome it, but I don't think it substitutes for the DEC, meaning the DEP, the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, to increase the capacity of the sewer system.
I guess no one has heard. One of the things that I was struck with very powerfully in the presentation was when you showed those proposals along near the financial district in Manhattan for more development. And what I realize is that what we live in an era when the notion is somehow that unless the private sector does it, it can't be done. And so the question is, how do you do something that's profitable for the private sector? The problem that you raise, as I see it, is that there's inherent clash between what is profitable and what's the long-term best interests of the society. And so the only notion the city keeps coming up with is to put up more taller buildings in places.
Well, I mean, the fact is that with progressing sea level rise, New York City usable land will shrink. So densification is clearly a necessity, whether we like it or not. So that means higher buildings. But that's why we need a comprehensive plan. And I'm amazed that the real estate sector hasn't been smart enough to speculate on the highest locations, not the cemeteries, on the highest locations in areas that have low density right now. And that's where rezoning sooner or later will happen, whether we like it or not, because even the slow moving real estate speculators will eventually realize elevation is much more precious land than waterfront. Everybody still wants to live on the waterfront right now, to have the big view over the harbor. That's short thinking.
Well, yes, Daniel.
Yes, thank you. You talked a lot about New York City, obviously, because that's where we live and we're located, and we're not doing so well. Are there areas in the world where you would judge the approach to be more judicious and better planned, and that we should take as examples?
Well, you know, it's interesting that in the past, everybody has taken the Netherlands as the smart kid on the globe, meaning that they have dealt for the last at least 800 years, maybe 1200 years, and lived with the ocean and actually have made water, swamps, and marshes and bogs into developed land, so-called polders. Okay? And so they are often held up as, oh, we should follow their example. But that's why I showed you my first slide. This is part of the time when sea level rise was constant. And so to go to the Dutch for help right now, even so Amsterdam and Rotterdam are probably one of the best developed cities in that context. Copenhagen is following on its heels, more looking forward. Even London, that has protected itself through the times barriers the last half century since the 1952-53 storm. After that, the barriers were built, is thinking about a new plan ahead, but it's still relying on new barriers built farther down the Thames Valley. And I think that's again postponing only the thing. So if you ask me, are there any places in the world where we really have grappled with the long-term solutions? I would say, unfortunately, no. There are individuals, there are communities, there are movements. San Francisco has an interesting plan. Portland, Oregon is grappling with one. And even New York City is starting to grapple with one. Forget about Palm Beach. I mean, Florida, you just can write it off. If you guys own any land down there, sell it now, as long as you can sell it, okay? I mean,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Elliot?
Hi, yes.
Yeah. Tell me, do you have the ear of our new mayor?
not I myself, but I have worked with a person called Amy Chester. She is the CEO of this NGO called Rebuilt by Design. And she has had very good communications with Adams. And actually she had arranged for him and her to take a trip up to the Netherlands. Luckily, that was canceled for the reasons that I just mentioned to you, because I think the Netherlands are not any longer the masters of the world when it comes to climate change. Yes, they have smart engineering and they're looking forward to it, but they are struggling with sea level rise as much as any other nation now too. They don't have a plan.
I want Adams to sit down and hear your presentation. I mean, you know, that's where the message needs to go.
We're working on that, but the city council too.
Yeah,
It's not just the
sure.
okay? The people that control the money.
Exactly. Yes, 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 yes.
She got to unmute. Sheila's going to unmute. No, you're still not.
Okay. Thank you. I was just wondering if the speaker doesn't think that the initiatives in the Netherlands to do the relocation of moving the people that are on the lower grounds into higher ground, and I don't know how they've been able to achieve that, having people give up their homes and their farms and move, but that seems to me to be extraordinarily at the forefront of
Yes, you point out one program that the Netherlands has developed, which is very interesting. They take certain polders or areas that are at or below sea level and buy the people out, but they buy them out only temporarily. Then they guide the Meuse or the Rhine into those polders to build up the sediments and then bring more stuff in to raise it even more. And then they close it for the rivers and intend to bring the people back and build new buildings for them.
Yeah.
That is an amazing program, but only a nation like the Netherlands can afford that. I mean, we could afford it too if we had to pull it.
But nobody here would agree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's one program that the Netherlands had developed, but to do that for the entire Netherlands, after all, Netherlands means lowlands, okay? And I was tell my friend Ovik, Henk Ovink, who is actually the water czar in the Netherlands, how are you doing in developing friendships with the Swiss, Austrians, French, and Germans? Because that's where the Netherlands has to move eventually somewhere. Look at the Pacific Islanders, the Marshall Islands,
Yeah.
and others. They have bought land in the Fiji Islands and already have moved a good proportion of their population to the Fiji Islands. That's what, you know, already is going on. We are not even aware of that.
Yeah, we don't even think about it. Amazing. Thank you. Your presentation was wonderful.
Welcome.
So we're all feeling a little bit better about being very old now because
Well, that's why we have those young folks that stand up for this stuff.
Yeah. No, but I think that what is missing is this comprehensive kind of view that Klaus was able to give to us is missing from a lot of the conversations, and people talk in sound bites, and they don't understand that this is a long-term dynamic. These changes have been a long time coming, and it's going to take large investments to change them. And then there's the equity issue that does not go away, that needs to be part of any solution. So I think I am so grateful to be an institution with a faculty that have people like Klaus doing the kind of work that they're doing, and that we're all part of it. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It was a tour de force. Thank you very, very much. And thank you all for coming, and stay tuned for our next newsletter and our next event. And we will all be in touch.
Yes. Always
Okay.
on the bright side of life.
Thank you, Klaus. Bye-bye.
We are right on time.